Hello and welcome to India Speak, a podcast by the Center for Policy Research. I'm Sushant Singh, Senior Fellow at CPR. In this series, we have been speaking to leading experts and academics on the many facets of Sino-India relations. An important aspect of the China-India rivalry is often visible in the countries of South Asia. Today, we are looking at Nepal and its relationship with China, as it stands after Chinese Foreign Minister and State Councillor Wang Yi paid a visit to Kathmandu. To do that, our guest today is a Nepalese publisher, editor, commentator, and writer. Kanak Mani Dixit is the founder of the magazine Himal South Asian and co-founder of Himal Media. He has degrees in law from Delhi University and international relations and journalism from Columbia University. He has been a journalist since 1971 and worked in the United Nations Secretariat between 1982 and 1990. Lately, he has been engaged in civil rights activism in relation to peace, democracy, and human rights in Nepal. He's an author of children's books and has contributed to several South Asian anthologies. He's also the author of two works of political commentary, Dekhe Ko Mulk, The Country I See, and Peace Politics of Nepal. Kanak, welcome to India Speak.
Thank you, Sushant.
Kanak, the day Wang Yi landed in Kathmandu, you wrote a long essay, by your own admission a bit too long, in Nepal Times, highlighting the broken parts of the Nepal-China relationship and asking him to have a better understanding of Nepal. The link to the essay is in the show notes. I hope Wang read that essay and the Chinese embassy in Kathmandu got it translated in Mandarin. Now that the visit is over, what do you make of Wang's trip? How did it go, particularly from a Nepalese perspective?
I personally believe that Wang, Sushant, was in Kathmandu to sort of make amends for certain overreach by Chinese commentators who we take to mean as taking the position of the Chinese state in relation to Nepal. Several things that have gone wrong lately, some of them having to do with Nepali overreach, but the largest issue had to do with a particular grant from the United States to Nepal for $500 million called the MCC, Millennium Challenge Compact, to make transmission lines and highways. It was a pure grant of $500 million. And at the time of COVID, when international grants had dried up, it is a bonanza for Nepal. But the Chinese suddenly piped up, if that's the right word, to oppose it publicly before it was adopted by Nepal's parliament, the agreement. So I feel that there was a patch-up needed. And we can come to the MCC later. But I believe essentially Wang Yi's visit was to reach out to Nepal, which is a vital state for the Chinese, even though China borders many countries of Asia and South Asia. But Nepal is vital because it's in the Himalayan rimland, with India on the other side, which it has problems, and with the Tibetan population on this side. So for these reasons, I think the Chinese made an extra effort to come to Kathmandu. I believe that the results have been mixed in that there was a pro forma meetings and there was no bilateral communique, if I remember. But from the readouts from the Nepali side, there was not a mention of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been the Chinese foreign policy's flag of the last 5 years at least, and with President Xi Jinping wanting that. But the Nepalese obviously chose not to highlight that. So I believe Wang Yi would have gone back thinking that he's made some amends for the highly charged commentary from coming out of Beijing in the last few months. But beyond that, I think we are not much further ahead in mending Nepal-China ties to the extent, in my view, that we need the Chinese to better understand Nepal and Nepalese rather than to think of Nepal as a supplicant state, which I believe they do.
What do you mean when you say that the Chinese do not understand Nepal? What would it require for them to understand Nepal better? What is it that they get wrong about Nepal?
They do not interact enough with Nepalis. We do not know who they talk to, how they make up their point of view. For all the mistakes that, for example, India makes, India has a wide network of journalists, civil society, average Nepali citizens that they will, as a matter of course, meet. Whereas you do not know who the Chinese meet and who they talk to and what kind of opinions they make based on actual interactions. Instead, it is a kind of imperious, if not imperial outlook. And not to blame the Chinese entirely, the Nepali response has been at some points near servility or obsequiousness. And there is a reason for that, what we can get to. But the Chinese essentially need to understand Nepali society, the Nepali people's desires, for example, for democracy, which would be hard for the Chinese to understand, but they would have to, because what we know is the Chinese were very supportive of the royalty in Nepal, the king in Nepal, when Nepal was when Nepal was a constitutional monarchy, before that a monarchy, and that would seem incongruous to some because China is a communist country and this is a monarchy. But China's primary focus vis-a-vis Nepal is political stability. They want to know who they're dealing with, and there is some kind of a planning that they can do in Nepal. After Nepal became a republic and the rambunctious and querulous democracy that it has become, with many parties, many voices, lots of rancor, China feels that we need somebody stable in Nepal, but it has not done. Firstly, it should accept that Nepal will be like this. We will not go back to being the stable country, whether a dictatorship or a democracy, that China play with. China will have to understand Nepal better, Kathmandu better, to play and roll with the punches. I don't think they've got the capacity at this point, whether they have think tanks studying Nepal or whether they have individual scholars studying Nepal. And even there, we don't know whether these think tanks and scholars really have a say in the central CPC corridors, the Communist Party of China, which essentially defines China's foreign policy and directs the Chinese foreign ministry. We actually are flying blind when it comes to who looks out of China into Nepal. And this might be true with other countries as well.
Kanak, you spoke of the Washington's Millennium Challenge Corporation, or the MCC project. For our listeners who may not be aware of the issue, can you help it summarize for them and also bring in the Sri Lanka and the other examples which were part of the MCC?
About a decade and a half ago, I believe, when the Americans were deciding how to have a different type of support outside of the US to support developing countries, they decided on a criteria having to do with governability, corruption or lack of corruption, democratic values, etc. And then they put out a call. Nepal also applied, like other countries, and you had to make the grade, and make the grade in a nice way, that essentially you're a democracy to begin with. I don't believe the Americans do everything right by a long shot. They have their own burdens to carry, including in Nepal. But when it comes to the MCC, in relation to what was offered to Nepal, it was a clean grant that was negotiated over 10 years. And finally, it was ready for the signing. And a demand, a requirement was slipped in that it had to be passed by Parliament. It need not have been, but that came about. And okay, that's a long story. So things came to a head when Nepali politics has changed enough and the players wanted to utilize MCC for their purpose, stand against the MCC for their purpose. And so the major parties, the UML and the Nepali Congress, were for it. The person who was decidedly against it was a coalition partner of the current government, Mr. Pushpa Kamal Dahal, known to the world as Prachanda, the Maoist chieftain. He decided to play politics by raising that, ante on MCC, essentially letting his supporters and circle to present the MCC as an imperialist project. against Nepal's greater good. And this is where things came to a head, and where China comes into the picture is at the last moment when MCC was about to be passed by Parliament. China came out publicly against it. The spokesperson in Beijing of the Foreign Ministry came out, called it, said adopting the particular resolution in Nepali Parliament would be opening up a Pandora's box. They spoke of the American influence without naming America in getting Nepal to pass this as a part of coercive diplomacy. The main problem I have with what they did was they denied Nepal the agency of adopting it for its own good. Rather, they saw it as a play of the United States in Nepal. And I believe that is where China got, in a way, found out, because it seemed to have actively worked for Nepal not to get a $500 million grant.
Kind of two questions on this. What kind of projects were exactly there in the MCC? I believe there were only power projects and infrastructure projects, road construction projects. Were they in any way detrimental to the Chinese interests? And the second question is that even Wang Yi's statement yesterday in Nepal, or on Saturday in Nepal, asking the outside powers not to interfere, was almost in the same tone and tenor as the earlier statement of the Chinese Foreign Ministry that you referred to.
Yes, that comes out of the readout from the Chinese side. The Nepali side tried to downplay it. What the Nepali side did not do was to refer to BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, which China really pushed on Nepal as well as the rest. And it's not entirely a bad thing, but indicative that Nepal preferred not to mention it at all. Whereas the Chinese readout is essentially what you said. And I believe that that was very undiplomatic. And if Wang Yi's visit to Nepal was to make amends, that one statement, if he has said it, that Nepal should have an independent stance, and China stands for an independent Nepal with a full flexibility vis-a-vis its international scope. It was a pointed reference to the fact that Americans foisted, quote unquote, foisted MCC. MCC itself, to go back to your earlier question, is in my view, an innocent project provided in Nepal by the Nepalis. And if somewhere it becomes coercive down the line, Nepalis are alert enough to reject it. And there is a clause in there, 3 months or so, after which you can get out of it. But what the project actually is it's mostly a project for high tension lines, transmission lines, electricity transmission lines, to make up for a shortfall in the grid within Nepal. After many years of negotiations, the MCC team that included Nepali and American officials decided that, as Nepal wanted, the thing that was lacking was power evacuation from the many hydropower stations that are being made in Nepal. And so it is good for Nepal's economy, it's good for Nepal's society, and there is no doubt that this would be good for Nepal. The other point is a smaller quotient of that project is for some highway maintenance essentially.
Kanak, you earlier spoke about that Beijing is now making the same mistakes in Nepal which New Delhi earlier made. And that's something a lot of Indian commentators gloat about, that we learned our lessons the hard way in Nepal. Now China is going to learn the same lessons. But what are those mistakes? Everybody says that we are making the same mistakes. What are those mistakes that China is now making there? Well, and is China likely to course correct, or you don't see any signs of it at all?
Well, to begin with, the Nepali society marches to a different drummer for various reasons. One of it could be that it was non-colonized, so the world doesn't understand Nepal enough, and it doesn't invest in understanding Nepal enough. That there is a kind of nationalism and a kind of a resilience in society that if you go beyond a point, then the society rejects. So they'll keep quiet long enough, and then they'll come up and reject any idea or anything being foisted on Nepali society. And there, the Indians have certainly messed up in the past. And the fact that I wrote that the Chinese are making the same mistakes that the Indians have made does not necessarily mean that New Delhi will not make mistakes in future, because New Delhi was taught, if you don't mind my using the term, a kind of a lesson during the blockade that India conducted in Nepal in the second half of 2015 as indication of displeasure for the constitution that was adopted in September 2015. And that was just the most egregious kind of activism that the Indian state did. But before that, there was a lot of what you call micromanagement of Nepali state affairs by India. Much of that happening because the Indians allowed much of that happening because the Nepalis allowed the Indians that space. The Indian diplomats, the Indian spooks, they allowed that space. But when something as horrific as the 5.5-month long blockade was conducted, the Nepali public sort of came together to resist. It was an economic hardship that they bore, much harsher than what the earthquake of 2015 April, the kind of impact it had on Nepal. So that was the blockade. In a way, it's like the apogee of Indian interventionism. Now,
Kanak, if I may intervene, I was there with you in Nepal during the blockade, and I remember even the elite of Nepalese society, top generals, top politicians, actually using firewood to cook. And I remember sitting on the roof of your house and discussing this early in the morning. Nepal was going through a very, very tough time
Yes.
due to the blockade, and even some of the elite areas, some of the high-end areas of Kathmandu were suffering.
The whole society was. And by now, there are enough Indian commentators who concede, even in their writings, that it was a blockade by India. But for a while, it was made as if it was the Madhesi agitation of the South, citizens blockading their own citizens, which was not really what was happening. But what is interesting to know in the context of Nepal, China, is that the Indian blockade of Nepal in 2015 was such bad or disastrous strategy on the side of India, because we all know India regards its northern Himalayan frontier as vulnerable, and Nepal also as a vulnerable neighbor because it borders the Himalaya. So everything to keep Nepal with you. But on the other hand, the Himalaya is no longer a strategic or economic barrier. So sooner or later, Nepal would open up to the north. What the blockade did was bring that date forward by about a decade at least. Meaning, when you did the blockade, Nepal suddenly realized, and the Nepali public, that we are not landlocked, but we are India locked. So we must reach out to the north, because it's not like we are absolutely without capacity of going elsewhere to get our land borders, transit to third countries, etc. So there was what I call a pivot. From Kathmandu did a pivot towards Beijing and signed a slew of agreements and protocols, one for cross-border trade with Beijing, one for connectivity, highways, transmission, railroads, all of them planned still now. But nevertheless, the northern Himalayan frontier of Nepal is breached for much closer interaction with China, and that is not a pie in the sky anymore, because the Chinese railway has arrived in the Tibetan plateau in 2000 in Lhasa and 2006 in Sigatse. And so you have, and you can look forward to a day that all these and the third country transit, 7 ports and dry ports and seaports are now allowed access for Nepal to reach out to the world. All of this happened. It would have happened 10, 15 years later. All of them, at least in terms of agreement on paper, were signed because of the Indian blockade. So this is how I see a problem that India, at least New Delhi, perceives as a problem, was generated by itself.
So I don't know if you read the former Indian ambassador to Nepal, Ranjit Rai's book, but he mentions a very specific line where Prime Minister Modi asked him, "Why do Nepalese hate us so much or dislike us so much?" Kanak, you seem to be almost suggesting that New Delhi or India made it too easy for Beijing in Nepal. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I'm saying exactly that. New Delhi not realizing, as I said earlier, that Nepal marches to its own drummer. I would just like to make a point about if it is Mr. Modi's understanding that the Nepalese hate India or dislike India, they don't. There is, firstly, there's an open border. Secondly, there's so much cultural interaction, not just between the Tarai communities and Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, but the hill communities of Nepal and and India. That there might be a kind of sense of suffocation at times when the Indian state comes down hard on Nepal, and that's why the the corrective is for India to let Nepal go its way. And fortunately, since the blockade, I feel that India has kept more or less to that track. And I would want it to keep on that track and China to learn from India to let Nepal be Nepal. That is what China should be doing. You asked in an earlier question, do I think the Chinese will learn? Well, given that Wang Yi came for what I was thinking was a fence mending exercise, but he was would not like any kind of coercion on Nepal's foreign policy because Nepal is independent. Well, that's a truism. Nepal is independent. Nobody need to make that a pointed reference that could be referring to any other country.
Kanak, what exactly are the drivers of this China-Nepal relationship other than India, that is, or India's behavior in 2015 or earlier? And if I may, how would you contrast them with the drivers of India-Nepal ties? They seem to be very distinct. India-Nepal ties seem to be driven more by culture, more by, as you said, open borders, trade, almost an integration of Nepal with India in sense of culture, economy, society, etc. Whereas with China, it seems to be more driven by BRI, tourism, keeping out of Tibet. How are the two drivers different? If you can enumerate them and explain.
Yeah, and whether Nepal is integrating into India or India is integrating into Nepal, it's more or less we're talking on the same frame that Nepali society knows and values its links, if you call it civilizational links to India. But historically, economically, Nepal was more linked to Tibet. And when we speak in historical terms, Kathmandu Valley was actually doing trade with Tibet, and it took on a lot of culture from the south, the Gangetic Plains. But its actual trade was more with Tibet than with the Indo-Gangetic Plains. So all of that changed with the Young Husband Mission of 1902 and 1903. And in a way, Tibet pivoted via Kalimpong into India, British India, rather than through Nepal. So when we talk now about Nepal-China links, I wrote this recent article also to remind Nepalese that you cannot neglect Tibet. Granted, as a part of China, everybody, even the Dalai Lama, would be looking at it in a more or less the same frame. He would want it to be truly autonomous within China. But as far as Nepal is concerned, regarding Tibet as a part of China is also that Nepal's historical linkages to the north have not been with Beijing. They have been with the border region, that is Tibet. Why is it important to say this? Because right now, Tibet is like almost not talked about in Nepal. Whereas for the sake of Nepal's culture and Nepal's economy, it is important for the Tibetan border to be opened up for people-to-people contact between people of Tibet and people of Nepal should continue. But for right now, it is a rigid blockade. And this rigid blockade also came up because Beijing is not yet confident enough about the optics of its control over Tibet. So particularly after the 2008 Olympics, Beijing Olympics, Beijing has made it very, the border between Nepal and India very harshly closed. As a result, the contact between the Tibetan-speaking people of Nepal and China, Tibet, the trade, and including now the trade from mainland China into Nepal through the Nepali border points. These have all dried up. And this is not fair and it is not good. I mention this because Nepal-Tibet linkages, while conceding and accepting Tibet as a part of China, the discourse in Kathmandu does not speak enough about Tibet. That's why I refer to it now. As far as the drivers of Nepal-China relationships are concerned, till now, it has mostly been about China's sense of vulnerability about any kind of activities in Tibet being supported out of Nepal. And that's why China ritually asks Nepal to repeat the line that we are for a one China policy, number one, and the other one, we will never allow our territory to be used against China. So I have proposed again in that article that there should be a billboard put up at the national arrivals lounge of the international airport in Kathmandu saying Nepal accepts one China policy as its policy, and Nepal will never allow its territory to be used against China, which is true. And Nepal would never do it. But why do we have to repeat it ad nauseum before every meeting? Before you even get into the substantive agenda in bilateral meetings, you're supposed to by rote repeat these lines. And this is not how you treat a respected neighbor.
Two parts you did not speak of. One is tourism, another is BRI, because none of the BRI projects have been signed so far. The BRI projects have all been announced, and the Nepalese elite talks so much about them, portrays them as something big. But the fact of the matter is that not even during this visit, nothing has been signed on BRI.
Yes. The Belt and Road Initiative, firstly, we must keep in mind that there was lots of Chinese activities, not only in Nepal, but around the world, infrastructure, loans given, etc. It's just that everything has now been subsumed into the title BRI, right? But then now we accept that there is this whole focus of the
Xi Jinping's vision
for China to promote infrastructure around the world. Now, the Himalaya needs any kind of work in the Himalayan region for connectivity, requires massive infrastructure and massive funds for the infrastructure. So what the Chinese and Nepalese have done is they have signed an agreement, kind of a framework agreement in 2017 for BRI projects. In the beginning, Nepalese went with a wish list that was too big, and the Chinese asked the Nepalese to whittle it down. So the only catch there is Nepal has been alerted enough of debt traps, including a debt trap vis-a-vis China, that they seem to be looking carefully at what is feasible for Nepal. And I believe, I haven't spoken to the officials yet, but I believe that the Nepali side, the position it took in Wang Yi's visit was that we want grants. Apparently, the Prime Minister Sherbaza Deuba specifically said, we want grants rather than loans. And BRI, from what I understand, it is have to be concessional loans at 2% or less. And I believe the Chinese, in the end, are mercantilists, and they have not been able to offer this. So we are right now at the position where we are merely deciding to do the detailed project studies of these BRI projects. The biggest one you should know about is a railroad planned from Rasuagari to Kathmandu, which means from the Chinese railway through the Himalaya breach coming into Kathmandu. I have a personal belief that the Chinese would never spend and give concession loans or grants for such massive infrastructure, miles and miles of tunneling through the Himalaya, etc., would never do it if they were not on the Indian market. So ultimately, Chinese are looking ahead to the day when what they try to convince the Nepalese are mainly for you guys is actually meant for them to access the plains market of the Gangetic Plains.
What about tourism? Because Nepal seems to be the favorite destination of Chinese tourists.
Well, the Nepal has never picked up enough on a statement made by President Xi Jinping when he came calling to Kathmandu, 2019, October, I think it was, where he said certain problematic things, but one of the things that he said, interestingly, was he said, among all the countries of South Asia, it is Nepal that the Chinese people want to visit the most. And the Nepali tourism industry has not been able to make enough of that statement, although in between we did have COVID. But what is interesting for especially an Indian audience to know is, without anybody really watching or planning, China is much better connected by air to Nepal than India is. There are at last count, 5 or 6 airports before COVID with daily, if not twice daily flights from Guangzhou, Kunming, Chengdu, even Shanghai at the last instance, and Lhasa, flights into Kathmandu daily over the Himalaya coming, whereas the Nepal-India flights have essentially stayed where they were. Calcutta, a few flights a week to Bangalore. There used to be some flights to Bombay, but after COVID, of course, everything has dried up. So it's mainly Delhi, Kathmandu, whereas the spread into China is much more. What is it doing? It is also taking Nepali students to China. Nepalis are now studying and understanding China better, studying Mandarin for sure, and coming back with a lot of understanding of the Chinese people and the Chinese government. And tourists are also coming in. If you go to Pokhara in central Nepal, where there's the lake and the grand view of the Annapurna, you'll find there are little lanes that are practically Chinatown. And Chinese signboards, without even English, indicates who the clientele is. The same with the touristic neighborhood of Tamil in Kathmandu. But I think the Chinese are what they are really eyeing in terms of a destination for Chinese pilgrim tourists, Lumbini, Kapilvastu. Why? Because there are 5 sites to the life of Siddhartha Gautam, the Buddha, and only one site is in present-day Nepal. All other sites are in present-day India, Kushinagar, Bodh Gaya, what have you, Sarnath. Whereas Lumbini, the birthplace of the Buddha, and Kapilvastu, regarded as the hometown or the home base of Lord Buddha, are in Nepal. And international airport is about to be completed, which is known as the Gautam Buddha International Airport, next to Lumbini. So you can expect hundreds of thousands of Chinese pilgrim tourists visiting Nepal. Also because there's an interesting evolution in terms of the Chinese state looking at what is the approved religion, quote unquote, within China, given that the growing middle class will need some spiritual solace. They're looking at what could be it. It certainly wouldn't be Falun Gong. It wouldn't be Islam. It wouldn't be anything else. So the Chinese do regard Buddhism as an indigenous religion or a faith because it arrived there early enough before it spread to the rest of Asia. So we expect in the days ahead quite an expansion of Chinese visitors to Nepal.
India and China are involved in a major border crisis in Ladakh for the past 22 months, which shows little signs of resolution. Wang Yi's visit to India just before landing in Nepal has not moved the needle at all on the relationship or on the border crisis. So what are the various views, whether dominant or non-dominant, in Nepal about the crisis?
Nepalis are only, at this point, the state as well as civil society are only passively reading up and looking at what is happening in Ladakh, in Galwan, and also before this, what is happening on the other side within Bhutan at Doklam and now at Arunachal. And it is in Nepal's interest, strategic interest, that India and China patch up, because One, Chinese assertiveness along the Himalaya makes it problematic for Nepal as well, because anything that makes India nervous constricts Nepal's own space, not only vis-a-vis China, but vis-a-vis India as well. You see, the Himalayan region, there's a kind of a paranoia in India that has not gone away since 1962, and the debacle here. And so the Indian policy analysts look at the Himalaya as a vulnerable space. And Nepal, the way they look at Nepal is also because Nepal is part of the Himalaya. And what the Chinese have gone and done with their assertiveness, which is, I think, a continuity of what they're doing from the South China Sea to Ladakh, is upturned the cart, so to speak. And what I see looking out from Kathmandu is an Indian inability to countenance or do anything about the Chinese activities. So if anything, even though this is not talked about, but India has fallen in esteem, if I might say, I'm choosing my words very carefully, it seems flummoxed by what, and that's the word I have used in my writings, by the Chinese assertiveness. I won't call it belligerence, but some may call it that. And India seems tongue-tied to do anything about it. So that certainly will have given, without commentators really talking about it in Kathmandu, it certainly would give a sense that India is weaker today than it was in the past vis-a-vis China.
Kanak, moving on, you've been a regular visitor to all the countries of South Asia. I know you've traveled to Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, very, very regularly, besides India, of course. How is Nepal of today different from today's Bangladesh or today's Sri Lanka? And I'm choosing these two countries carefully because there's a similarity in size, form of government, etc., when it comes to its foreign policy.
Nepal is perceived by the international community, including the South Asian community, as a kind of a basket case. And it's always in political turmoil. It is always changing prime ministers. It has kind of managed a conflict, but there still seems to be residues of conflict in the society. But I find it important to tell the world and to tell South Asia that at this point, for now, Nepal is the most free country of South Asia. It is a place where media is most free. There is least self-censorship, and the fundamental freedoms and human rights are the most at play. Now, that's saying a lot, because in my personal view, India is taking a back step, even though India was the exemplar for the rest of South Asia in terms of democratic values. And we all want India to remain where it is as an exemplar, also in terms of inter-community relations, in terms of fundamental freedoms, democracy, whatever you call it. But there seems to be a slippage in India. Regarding the other countries, they're more or less at various points of slippage. Sri Lanka, with the Rajapaksa brothers having a nepotistic control over society. Bangladesh doing economically very well, and everybody would want to emulate Bangladesh, including big India, to talk of, not to even talk about Nepal. But Bangladesh is got a brittle regime or governance system because it is very autocratic at this stage. And there is no opposition to speak of in Bangladesh. So in that sense, Nepal, for all the little but bad press it gets around the world, Nepal actually is the place to be right now. How Nepal could do better is if only we had more political stability in democracy, not political stability in autocracy. That South Asia is doing. Nepal can be the exemplar as a country that is a messy democracy, but remains open. We need this in Nepal because one, Nepal we've tried everything from autocratic monarchy to messy democracy. And now we're once again trying a messy democracy. Nepal succeeded in adopting a constitution when one constituent assembly didn't work, elected constituent assembly, not a nominated one, another constituent assembly. There are problems in our in the constitution document. There are contradictions. There are some issues there, but essentially it's a constitution that we can carry and work on it over years. So in that sense, there is also a foundational reason that Nepal will be stable. Where we have instability is in the political ambitions of individual players, particularly a player such as Pushpakamal Dahal Prachanda, who drags down the values of Nepali politics so low that Nepal becomes unstable. So if we can get over this period, I believe that Nepal needs and will remain a fine democracy by itself, but to be there for the rest of South Asia.
That's a very hopeful Nepalese view, Kanak. But final question, Kanak. Yeah. Where did South Asia go wrong? Going by what you spoke of Bangladesh, what is happening in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, of course, India. You mentioned. Where did we in South Asia go wrong? And I'm just not limiting myself to SAARC, which is now seems to be on the verge of extinction.
Yeah. South Asia went wrong because all of us in each of our countries allowed not nationalism or cultural nationalisms to rule, but ultra-nationalism. That the ruling elites in each of our countries learned to use ultra-populism to promote ultra-nationalism. And there are where that ultra-nationalism is also laced with religion. Pakistan taught us how to do it, and certainly India seems to be following in that direction. So ultra-nationalism, religion-based cry to rouse the populace, all of this are giving us a lethal brew that separates us. The people who would want to look for social justice in the subcontinent through using the South Asia formula, which would essentially mean bring down the rigidity of the borders, allow economies of scale to work, allow trade to happen across. South Asia trades the least among itself. Whereas when you look at the historical evolution of South Asia, we're essentially one large, you could use the word civilization, and it's not cut up. And there is a great asymmetry because the largest, and that too in the center, that gets to define what much of the world understands of South Asia. So what happened with South Asia, I believe, is that there was a good idea that we must try to bring down these barriers, but it was formulated wrong. For example, SAARC was essentially an organization of 8 foreign ministries. And anything that has to be promoted has got to have the agreement of all 8. There's no leeway there. So it becomes a rigid organization, and there has not been the visionaries leaders of South Asia who understand that you need a SAARC-like South Asian formula because it will make people richer. It'll provide more social justice. There'll be more local or regional government. These are the kinds of visions that a South Asia vision should have been, or South Asia ontology or conceptualization. But unfortunately, South Asia to you and me, as it is presented, means a SAARC South Asia, which means I am a Nepali and you're an Indian, and we meet in a SAARC conclave as a Nepali and as an Indian. Whereas what you should be doing is South Asia being unique in relation to many other parts of the world, that your identity requires you to be On the one hand, at the local level, you're from some shahar or some mohalla, or you have this language and you have that faith. At the interpersonal level, there is that identity. Then you have the identity of the nation state. I'm Indian, you're Bangladeshi, you are Sri Lankan. But South Asia will never be complete unless you have an additional identity that links us to our past. And that is the term South Asia, which is a geographic term. But what it means is what earlier people might say is the broader Hindustan. Now, this doesn't mean we're looking for Akhand Bharat, right? Because it is something beyond that idea of the Akhand Bharat ideologues. I feel that we haven't done enough homework to make South Asia real. And so people just think, when they think South Asia, they think of SAARC. And when they think of SAARC, they think of an ineffectual organization. We haven't even begun to imagine what we have lost when we do not consider South Asia as a space for all of us. Someday, with some crisis, we may begin to think about that.
Let's hope, Kanak, that your vision comes true with or without a crisis. As always, it was a pleasure talking to you, Kanak, and I look forward to seeing you again, whether in Kathmandu or in Delhi. To all our listeners, thank you for listening. For more information on our work, follow us on Twitter at CPR_India and log on to our website at www.cprindia.org.